Well, we missed St. Patrick's Day by just one day, but still within the realm of the holiday. So let's talk some Notre Dame football here at the Voice of College Football. We got Nathan Erbach on the line. He joins us on a regular basis to break down the Irish. And we also have Brian Driscoll from Irish Breakdown. How you guys doing tonight?
Doing great.
Appreciate you guys coming on. And you have some exciting news regarding the recruiting progress just here in the last few weeks, Nathan. So I'll let you get things underway and you guys can take off from there because the commits are pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Brian would agree with this. A lot of it has to do with new defensive coordinator Marcus Freeman. Landing Joshua Burnham out of Michigan, a kid that was probably trending towards Michigan for the cycle until Freeman came on board and kind of flipped the script there. He did the same thing with the kid named Tyson Ford, out of Missouri, about a month prior to that. So two really good, linebacker, defensive end type prospects there. And then before that, they landed Jaden Nicky, a cornerback out of California, who is a top target there. I think they have some other corners on the board they like a little bit more, but Mickey's a really talented kid out of California, and a 4-star guy. And another thing I think Brian would agree with here is on most cycles, this might be their top corner. And this cycle, it might, maybe be their third corner if all goes, according to plan with the staff. And so those are definitely probably the three big commits over the last, couple of months or so. I know Brian will talk about those as well, but they've landed a few others too.
I think the thing for me, Nathan, is a lot of the guys you mentioned, they were not on the radar. They were on the radar, but they weren't a top 2 or 3 school for those guys. Penn State was considered the clear leader for Aiden Gabera until Marcus Freeman shows up. And same thing with Tyson Ford. Some people have reported he was a silent commitment to Oklahoma. Oklahoma was clearly trending. And I think Mike Elson was doing a good job there. But what we're seeing with Marcus Freeman is to recruit at the elite level, it can't be just the position coach. It has to be the position coach, the defensive coordinator. It has to be a bit more of a team type of thing. And when you throw what Mike Elson has done with Marcus Freeman, and you show what Mike Mickens has done, and then you bring in Marcus Freeman, I think that tag team approach has been far more effective. And what we're seeing from this group of defensive coaches especially, they're more willing to compete against the big boys, so to speak. They're not afraid to go into Michigan and compete for a kid that's been in Michigan lean forever. They're not afraid to go down to Texas and battle. They're not afraid to go out to California and battle. They're going after kids in Florida a lot more aggressively. They're going after, Kamari Rogers. Is this going to be a tough haul? Yeah, but you know what? You're always going to miss out on that kid when you don't try. And I think that's the thing we're seeing from this defensive staff. They're far more aggressive. Now, they're going to miss on most of them, but you only need 2 or 3 kids a year to get that you're not normally getting to kind of close that gap and take that next step. And especially at corner, they're going after some big boys after what was a great corner class last year, in my opinion.
Right. No, absolutely. I think, you mentioned Kamari Rogers, another kid who's a good friend of his, and Jair Brown, who's a current Ohio State commit. They're hard after him. There's obviously a few other guys on the board there. I know they've been kind of talking to Jaden Gold, who's actually a fellow teammate right now of Notre Dame's current QB commit, Stephen Angeli, who I think me and you both like to a certain degree. I know at least we've talked kind of in the past about this, that maybe we had some guys higher on our board.
Yeah.
I think in general, he brings, some stuff to the table. Big kid, kind of actually a little reminds me of Jack Cohen, the guy that they brought from Wisconsin to be the guy this year. Not sure if he's a game changer in the sense, maybe a Tyler Buckner, if he ever hits that ceiling. But I know you have kind of some thoughts on Angeli as well.
Yeah, look, he's a solid quarterback, and my criticism of Angeli is not that he's not a good player. Is he a player that you should be recruiting at Notre Dame in year 12 to take that next step? I don't really see that, and I'm going to give the coaching staff a little bit of a pass. I was very critical of the taking of Angeli, but I think they had a hard time adapting their recruiting philosophy at quarterback because of the pandemic, because they couldn't get kids on campus, because they couldn't go through the camps. I think their last 3 or 4 quarterbacks they've signed were kids that they worked out in person on campus, and they were like, okay, that's our guy. They got to see it. And I think they were slow to adjust their philosophy in the 2022 class, and it left them behind some guys that otherwise maybe they would have been able to get had they got on it sooner. What I like, however, is that they're already correcting that mistake. They're already going after some of the top 2013 quarterbacks. There's a kid out in California whose name I'm not even going to try to butcher on this show, who's a top player. They already offered him. Dante Moore from Michigan, they offered a scholarship yesterday. Nathan, I don't know if you've seen that kid, but he's outstanding. And those are the things you have to do. You have to get in early with these kids, these top-level kids. You can't be 6 months behind Alabama and 6 months behind Ohio State and Clemson if you're going to get these kids. And that's the thing I like that I'm seeing from the staff is they're being more aggressive. And it's going to result in, like I said, it's just 1 or 2 kids a year on both sides of the ball. That's the difference. And quarterback is one of those. And Tyler Buckner's got a chance to be that. But the difference between Notre Dame and Clemson is Clemson gets one of those guys kind of every other year. Ohio State gets those guys a little bit more regular. You know, they got Kyle McCord last year, who's a top 50 recruit, and they follow that up with the number 1 recruit in the country. That's the kind of thing you need to do if you're going to take that next step. And that's where offensively they're still lagging behind. I think defensively they're starting to show a little bit more aggressiveness in that regards.
And
Right.
I love the Nathan here real quick. I'll just get this in because I want to set Brian up for later in the conversation. As you guys get granular, I love it. Personnel breakdowns, just keep going. But I will want to flag down Brian before we get off here later in this hour. I don't know how much time you have, Brian, but I will, since this is the first time you've been on, love to get the take on Brian Kelly's work, his performance, and the broad view of where Notre Dame football stands. What's the difference between Notre Dame and the elite? You're alluding to it in regards to the recruiting process versus Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State. So we'll get to that point. But you guys take off on these commits.
I was just going to say, I mean, you mentioned Dante Moore, one of the kids they offered yesterday. I think he's ranked 12th right now on 24/7 Sports. So, I mean, clearly they're just from a ranking standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier too, just, you're not always going to land everybody, but then they offer Arch Manning, who's, one of the greatest, one of the big quarterback, recruits in the 2023 class. Obviously people know the last name, son of Cooper Manning and nephew of Eli and Peyton. So, I mean, probably not going to land him, but at least it's a kid that you're getting in on, like you said, and you can't win battles if you don't get it on him.
That's the thing is, the response of, well, you're not going to get him. He's not going to go to Notre Dame. I think Peyton visited Notre Dame back then. Obviously, that was, I think, a year after they had gotten Ron Paulus. But look, they probably won't get Arch Manning, but they definitely aren't going to get him if they don't offer him. Dante Moore. Well, yeah, you're not going to get him if you don't offer him. Kamari Rogers from Mississippi, the 2022 cornerback, that to me is a game changer for Notre Dame. You're not going to get him if you don't go after him and go after him hard. And that's the thing we're seeing. I think Clark Lee was a phenomenal defensive coordinator. I mean, tremendous defensive coordinator. And I think he was a good evaluator of talent, like a really good evaluator of talent. The problem was he was way too methodical to be able to recruit at Notre Dame like you need to recruit. Now that's going to work at Vanderbilt, I believe, because you're not going to fill your class up early on. You're going to have to find some of those developing players that maybe have jumps as seniors. But at Notre Dame, it often left them kind of behind the 8 ball. I mean, a place like Notre Dame should never whiff at linebacker and safety in the same class. And that's exactly what happened in 2020 class. And the big reason for that was they were just so late getting in on these kids. By the time they finally went through the evaluation process and settled on kids, they had missed out on guys. So I think what we're seeing from this staff is a lot more aggressiveness, but also being willing to overlook, hey, maybe this guy doesn't have the 6'2", 38-inch arms or whatever that they're looking for, but this kid can play football. And I think Jaden Mickey's a perfect example. I don't think he's a player Notre Dame would have moved as quickly on a year ago. And I think it would have probably cost them a guy like Jaden Mickey. I think the fact that they said, hey, look, this kid has a lot of the football skills we look for. As a sophomore, he was super productive. We had John Garcia from SL American on our show this morning, and this we talked about. Look, you're talking about a kid that plays against St. John Bosco, Mater Dei, Orange Lutheran, and as a sophomore, he's got 6 picks, and he's in double-digit in passes defense as a sophomore. You got to look at some point in time for production, and that's what I like about this staff. They like the length. They want the intangibles and the tools and the measurables. But at the end of the day, if a kid can play football, you go get him. And that's what I like about it. I think that aggressiveness is going to pay off. Maybe it doesn't pay off as much in 2022, although it's, like you said, paid off a little bit. But I think it's really going to be a benefit to Notre Dame when you look at that 2023 class. On defense, offense, there's still some other question marks, but defensively, at least, we're seeing a big jump.
Right. And I think specifically, I mean, defensive line and linebacker recruiting looks to be taking that jump right now. I mean, they already have Burnham and Ziegler in the class, who's obviously Ziegler was committed prior to Marcus Freeman anyway, but I know me and you both like his skill set and what he can do. But they're in on a lot of linebackers. I mean, again, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, but
Tuialamaka.
Tuialamaka out of California, Modern Day. I mean, he's out of Bishop Alamania.
Bishop Alamania, yeah.
Ephesians Prysock is a corner recruit that they're in on from the same program.
He might be the longest cornerback I've ever seen in my entire life.
Well,
no, seriously. I saw a picture of him yesterday where he was in a stance at the line of scrimmage, and I swear he could have been putting his fingers on the top of the grass. His arms are incredibly long. It's like,
yeah.
He's the kind of guy that I look for, Nathan. You talk about him. He's an under the radar guy. There's other corners that are higher on the board, but the thing I love about him is he brings some of that versatility that I think is an absolute must in a 5 DB defense, which is ultimately what Marcus Freeman wants to do. Notre Dame was a 4-2-5 under Mike Elko and Clark Lee, but they weren't a true 4-2-5 because the 5 is supposed to mean 5 DBs. When they've had Drew Tranquil, Osmar Bilal, and Jeremiah Wusu-Koromoa is that guy, and those are linebackers essentially. So you have a guy like that who brings that length. The advantage to having more of a traditional long DB in that nickel role, that slot role, is it provides you more coverage potential. And that's what made Jeremiah Wusu-Koromoa so unique, because he could cover like a DB. Those guys are hard to find, though. You know, those 215 to 220-pound guys that are true linebackers and how they play, but can cover that's why he's going to be a first-round pick. But if you can find a DB that can be a force against the perimeter pass, against the perimeter runs, but they can cover, that's a huge asset. And the other thing about those long guys like Ephesians Prysock is you don't have to be a 4-4 guy to be effective, because you may have a step on me, but when I stick my go-go gadget arms out, I'm going to be able to make that same play that the 5'11 guy that runs a 4-4 is going to be able to make.
Right.
And that's what I really like about him. He could be a corner. He could be a boundary corner when he gets stronger. I think he could play the field to certain, in more of a zone type of guy. He can play the slot. And if he fills out, I think he could play some safety too. That middle of the field when you're playing cover one, that kind of rangy, deep center fielder kind of guy. He's an interesting guy that people may say, well, they're just recruiting him to get Tuialamaka. And I'm like, well, because he can ball too. I mean, that kid can play. And I do like the fact, and I want to ask you this, Nathan, have you noticed that they seem to be a lot more active in the Southwest and West Coast this year than they have been in recent years? I mean, they've got some guys from the West Coast, obviously Buckner, Isaiah Foskey, but they seem to be a lot more involved with more players from California, Arizona, and Texas than we've seen in past years. A lot more aggressiveness there. And I think that's going to pay off, because Arizona is an up-and-coming state that's producing a lot more high-level talent than it has in the past. And a lot of those kids are transplants. They're not native Arizonians or whatever you call it. And I think that's another area, kind of like Atlanta has been to Notre Dame, where I think they could have some success if they're willing to go in there, and they're starting to do that. You obviously got Tosh Baker, and I like the fact that they're being more aggressive in those states, especially since Texas is, not Texas yet. I mean, see if you can steal a kid or two from there. I think it's a smart strategy, and I like the aggressiveness they're showing out there.
I was going to mention specifically, I mean, I know yesterday they had the 30 or so offers that went out, and a lot of them were in Texas and specifically in the South. You had a lot of Florida kids as well. But no, I mean, you mentioned Arizona. I mean, obviously they're in on Anthony Lucas, the defensive tackle. I think 24/7 Sports has him as a 5-star billing right now.
He's a beast. That kid that's a program changer kind of kid, in my opinion.
Right, exactly. And then I think Deuce Robinson out of the 2023 class.
Teammate of Tosh Baker.
Same school as Tosh Baker. I think Morrison, the corner, I think he's a 2022 corner. I'm not sure how involved they are. I think they just made his top 10 or whatever, but he's another kid out of Arizona. And you're right. I mean, they're not typically too heavily involved in those states. I've noticed, I mean, I'm a Nevada guy, and I've noticed actually recently they're kind of getting back into Bishop Gorman, which is a huge program. Obviously Alize Mack, Nico Fertitta, Ronnie Stanley specifically are 3 guys that went to Notre Dame from Bishop Gorman. being in on Cyrus Moss this year. They offered a couple of his teammates. I think one's committed to USC right now. And then I think they just offered another kid out of Nevada yesterday who's actually Desert Pines, which is interesting because I know you guys probably don't know Desert Pines like I know Desert Pines. But that's not typically a high school that you would think of for Notre Dame. It's a public school. It's sort of in a bad area of town. But they produce a lot of talent. A lot of those kids go to USC. A lot of those kids go to Oregon and so on and so forth. I mean, I think this kid had an Alabama offer, so he's obviously doing something right at the high school level. And happy to see that they're getting on some Las Vegas talent. Because just like what you said with Arizona, a lot of kids that play in Vegas aren't necessarily from Vegas originally. They're transplants from California specifically. But Vegas in general, even without that, has a lot of high school talent at both the basketball and the football level. And it's good to see Notre Dame getting involved there.
I'd like to get to spring practice in regards to, we all know it's difficult to get information, to know exactly what's going on. We don't get the firsthand knowledge or the firsthand look, at least. But we are going to have a spring game, I would think, unless it's been announced that in regards to what Notre Dame's doing.
They
Brian?
haven't announced that there will or won't be. I would assume there will be. I think the only question will be whether or not it's going to be open to the public and not just like family and students or people on campus already.
So, Brian, for you, what storylines, what positions, what particular players, what's going to make you feel better about this team having made progress in the spring?
Well, I know Nathan knows where I'm going to go with this one, and it is I want to hear from people that they're changing the offense and adapting to more of a modern offense. I look, the ball control thing can get you so far. It's how you make sure you don't lose to teams you're not supposed to lose to, but it's not going to beat the teams that you should beat, because the funny thing is Notre Dame fans complain about how they don't have enough playmakers, but then they run an offense that dictates you have to have studs outside if it's going to be effective. You can't run the offense Notre Dame runs without Chase Claypool and Will Fuller. It requires great talent. You're not scheming guys into separation and into openings and scheming guys the way that Alabama does and the way that LSU did and Clemson did, and they're scheming with really good players. And so I'd like to see them open it up. I'd like to see them push the tempo a little bit. I don't think they need to be like Oregon under Chip Kelly. That's not what I'm calling for, but just be more aggressive, be willing to get more athletes on the field, spread the field out, bring the RPOs back. Ian Book ran RPOs in 2018, and he completed 70% of his passes. He never sniffed that completion percentage or those yards per attempt or the yards per game that he had in his first year in his next 2 years when they eliminated RPOs from the offense. And when you look at how it affected the run game, everybody talks about how good Kyron Williams was, and his numbers were good, but Kyron Williams had 0.6 yards less yards per carry than Tony Jones Jr. had the year before. He had the lowest yards per carry for a starting running back at Notre Dame since 2014. And that's not because Kyron Williams isn't really good, because he is really good. But when they know, once they read run, once they dictate, once a safety sees that Notre Dame's offensive linemen are blocking for the run, they're flying downhill because they know you're not going to run an RPO against them. And I think doing things like that could not only impact your pass game, allow you to spread the field, get the ball outside, get your playmakers the ball, but now all of a sudden you're giving Kyron Williams and Chris Tyree more room to run. And that duo, if you have teams have to respect the perimeter, which they didn't do last year, good luck trying to stop Chris Tyree and Kyron Williams when that's going on. So those are things for me, Mark. I think Notre Dame is close in a lot of ways. But if they're not willing to be more aggressive and take more risks, I think Brian Kelly has become risk averse later in his career. And it's like, hey, we may not beat Clemson and Alabama, but we're not going to lose to Northwestern again. We're not going to lose to Louisville again. Notre Dame in the last 4 years is something like, I think it's like, if you look at 15, 17, 18, 19, and 20, Notre Dame's something like 51-0 against teams that finished the year unranked. That's consistency, but they're barely over 500 against teams that finished in the top 25. That's the next step for Notre Dame, and you have to be willing to take some chances and be more willing to take shots to win those games. You're not going to beat Alabama 17-14. It's just not going to happen. You got to be able to score.
And some people might say it's recruiting related, and I think to a certain extent it might be, but I think me and you agree that they have the wide receivers on the roster.
Sure. Got to use them.
Right. And last year, I guess there were some injuries involved with Austin and Lindsey. But I know me and you both think that Jordan Johnson and Xavier Watts could have probably produced at a decently high level as freshmen. You got a Lorenzo Styles coming in this year, who is a really highly rated kid and really dynamic with the ball in his hands. So, from that regard, there's really no excuse not to get those guys on the field and see what they can do, even when they're young.
Yeah. Because you guys know what the narrative is. The narrative is you've got an NFL offensive line. You've improved the defense considerably in terms of strength, speed, conditioning, everything on that side of the football. And that you've got a quarterback in Ian Book, who there could be a debate about in regards to him being a game manager, but then he lit up Clemson, and suddenly the world's eyes were open to what Ian Book could possibly do, that he was kind of this Brett Favre gunslinger all of a sudden out of nowhere. And but that, exactly to Nathan's point, that there's just the difference between the three schools that we all know the names versus Notre Dame is game changers on the outside. Is that accurate?
I do they have a Devontae Smith on their team? No, they don't. But, I remember in 2018 when they lost to Clemson, Brian Kelly said, we just need more playmakers on the perimeter. And I'm thinking, you have Miles Boykin and Chase Claypool, a pair of 6'4" guys that ran a 4.42 and a 4.43 at the combine and both jumped over 40 inches. Like you had Dexter Williams at running back. You had Kevin Austin on the sideline, Braden Lindsey on the sideline, not getting any playing time. You had Tommy Tremble on the sideline, not getting any playing time. And you had Alize Jones and Cole Kmet. And I'm like, if you don't have enough playmakers of that group, then I quit. I don't know. I give up. I don't know what else you need. And, so that's kind of the frustrating thing is you've got these guys. And I argued with people going into the combine about Miles Boykin. I argued with people going into the combine about Chase Claypool because they said, well, those guys can't stretch the field. I'm like, look, I'm at every game. I'm not watching it off TV. I'm watching it live. I'm watching Chase Claypool be open by 3 or 4 yards down the field, and the ball's not coming. For a while, I kind of blamed Ian Book for that. But what I've come to realize is it's just one of those things where when it's beat into your head, don't do this. Don't turn the ball over. 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 There becomes a point in time where you're too neurotic about turnovers. So you don't want to turn the ball over. But I think you can focus so much on it that you almost paralyze your quarterback. And I think that's a part of the reason we've seen so much regression from quarterbacks at Notre Dame during their tenures in South Bend. And you see Ian Book come out and go 70% of his passes. He's almost 9 yards per pass attempt. If Ian Book would have completed 70% of his passes and been almost 9 yards per pass attempt this year like he was in 2018, who beats Notre Dame? I mean, it's just a different situation. And so can they get better athletes at receiver? You always try to get better. But it's like you have the athletes, they're standing behind. If you want to know where the playmakers are, coach, turn around. They're standing behind you on the sideline. You're the only school in America that doesn't get freshman receivers on the field with any kind of consistency. So it's because of the complexity of the offense. And, as every other school in the country is looking to simplify the offense, Notre Dame has made it more complicated. And that's the thing that needs to change.
Yeah. It's funny. All you have to do is turn on. I know you mentioned I don't go to as many games as Brian does, so he gets to see him live. I see him more on TV. But even then, you watch the film or watch the game. Turn on Chase Claypool for the Steelers this year, or just watch Miles Boykin when he's playing LSU before he was featured really in the offense, and he makes an incredible catch and runs for 53 yards down the field or whatever it was. And Claypool did that several times. I mean, watch Braden Lindsey in 2019 when he got the ball in his hands and what he did. I mean, the USC end around is a really good example of that. And I know Brian said that they don't really get freshman wide receivers, on the field consistently. But then you go look at the times that they have, and two notable times. I mean, obviously the teams were down, but TJ Jones, great player as a freshman, great player at Notre Dame in general, ended up being at least a decent player in the NFL for a few years. And then Kevin Stepherson was completely dynamic as a freshman. And if he never got into trouble off the field, he probably would be a first or second round pick.
He'd be getting a big paycheck. Yeah.
He's just a really talented player. And I think he actually probably still could be if he gets the opportunity, this season. So those are two really good examples of guys that did get on the field as freshmen, whether or not Brian Kelly wanted to put him on the field or not, and he had to. But they showed they can produce when they do.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, Nathan, if you don't mind. Mark, can I kind of dive into that?
Absolutely.
So here's the thing. It was funny, the first 2 big years that Brian Kelly had at Notre Dame, the 12-0 year in 2012 and 2015, he had first-year starters at quarterback. He had a redshirt freshman both years. Now, Malik Zaire was a redshirt sophomore when he took over in 2015, but he got hurt in the second game, and Deshaun Kaiser took over. And both times they had to kind of dumb things down a little bit, for lack of a better term, and make it a little bit more simplified. And you saw an efficiency level and explosiveness from those groups, especially the 2015 group. That was still by far Notre Dame's best offense under Brian Kelly. I mean, they set a school record for 7 yards of play. That's big time production there. And then you look at the 2010 when they had TJ Jones play. Remember, that was the year they had to move Theo Riddick to receiver because they didn't have any other receivers. I mean, there were no options. Your next best receiver was John Goodman. And, I mean, that was it. And then in 2015 or 2016, the year you're talking about, you had Torrey Hunter Jr. was their only veteran. He was it. And then you had Equinemi St. Brown was a sophomore. CJ Sanders was a sophomore. I think Miles Boykin was a redshirt freshman. Chase Claypool was a freshman. Kevin Stepherson was a freshman. Javon McKinley was a freshman. Well, Stepherson didn't really play a whole lot. And again, you had a roster filled with young players. Well, then Torrey Hunter Jr. gets knocked out against Texas. Remember that hit he took in the end zone? He missed the next 2 games. That's when Kevin Stepherson got his shot, and then he made plays, and then, of course, you had to play him the rest of the year. And so that's the thing I point to is there have been those anomalies you could easily point to say, well, that's why that guy played, because they didn't really have anybody else to play. And what I wish Coach Kelly would look at and say, look at the success those young guys had when you actually did play them. They've been pretty good when you actually do give a freshman running back chances. Look what Chris Tyree does, when you actually play a freshman tight end, look what he does. And people want to come back, well, Micah Mayer played. Well, you don't point to the exception to define the rule, right? There's got to be times where guys do need to sit. But, when you're playing Georgia in 2017 and you lose by 1 point to the team that eventually becomes the runner-up, and Cameron Smith, Freddie Canteen, and Chris Fink combined for over 100 snaps, and Miles Boykin, Chase Claypool, and Cole Kmet combined for 12. I mean, come on. Get your players on the field. Get your best players on the field. And I think what it comes down to, Nathan, is Coach Kelly on offense says, this is our offense, and we're going to have to fit our players into what we like to do, as opposed to what has made Clark Lee so successful, in my opinion, what made Mike Elko successful, and what will make Marcus Freeman successful if he does what he did at Cincinnati is, here's the players we have. Here's our best players. We make sure we tailor what we're doing to fit those players. If Coach Kelly's finally willing to do that, and I'm hearing some things that are telling me maybe he is, then I think you're going to see the offense become more explosive, and you're going to be like, wow, why is it every year that people are surprised how fast Notre Dame players are at the combine? It's like the last 5. Wow, shocked. I can't believe that Notre Dame player was that fast. I'm like, what? Yeah, well, you don't know if he's fast if you don't get him the ball. So that's the thing, is there's more talent than people realize. You just have to give that talent an opportunity, and that's what I'm hoping that we see from Coach Kelly this spring. And I think we're going to see some changes. I just don't know how much and how deep they're going to be.
I think I made the count. Go ahead, Nathan.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, I think after I think I had Nathan on after I made this comment to Nathan after the playoff game that the 1 touchdown drive for Notre Dame, while it was still a competitive game, of course they scored late. The touchdown that cut it to whatever 14-7, 21-7, whatever it was at that point, in one aspect was a thing of beauty if you enjoy that kind of football, where they were getting every first down by about that much. And they were just grinding it out and keeping Devontae Smith and Mac Jones and that group off the field. So it was beautiful. And I'm watching this thinking this is exactly what Brian Kelly wants. And this is what they want to do. Mm-hmm. But how many times can they replicate this? They can't replicate it enough during a game, right. Even if they keep Alabama on the sideline enough to where they can only score 3 or 4 touchdowns. Can they do this 3 or 4 times? Probably not, because you got to be perfect for like 13 or 14 consecutive plays. You can't have one misstep. You have to stay in front of the chains. You can't have a penalty. You can't have a sack. You can only have so many incompletions, because unlike Alabama, you watch them play and 2nd and 16, big deal. We're just going to, boom, boom, and we convert the first down.
Yeah. It's a very thin margin for error in that when you're doing it that way.
Yeah, no, I think, Brian, you hit the nail on the head earlier, and I kind of mentioned this a few times. Like Mark mentioned when we've talked, on previous occasions. That was the type of offense where Notre Dame could beat 95% of teams because they could out physical them. They could, even out athlete them, even though they don't necessarily use their athletes the way we want. Their defense was going to shut down a lot of those programs. When you play Clemson, when you play Alabama, when you play Ohio State, when you play Oklahoma, any of those teams, it's going to be harder to win when they're putting up 35 plus on anybody they play, no matter who they're playing. Because in general, I think, even to a certain extent, I know that Alabama probably let up. I'm not too upset with the way Notre Dame's defense played in that in the playoff game overall. But it was just like what Mark said. I mean, if Notre Dame was going to have any chance in that game, they had to play a flawless game, and every drive had to pretty much take off 8-9 minutes. And that's just not. I don't care who you are; it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
We do have a question coming in from D-Rock Irish here. Just basically asking, with the addition of defensive coordinator Marcus Freeman, whether you guys expect him to be on the sideline or up in the press box.
He's always been on the sideline. I would imagine that would continue. Most defensive coordinators like to be on the sideline. I think it's kind of funny. Most offensive coordinators like to be up in the press box, and most defensive coordinators like to be on the field. And I think part of that is because as a defensive coordinator, you just need much more of a feel for what's going on. You need to see the speed. You need to see the alignment. You need to see the tempo. You need to see how they're reacting and just to be there to make those changes. It's a lot easier to kind of make a change right before the snap as a defensive coach than it is as an offensive coach. You can't get off a false start because your defensive coordinator yelled at you and told you to look at you. So I would imagine he's going to be on the sideline like he's been the last couple of years at Cincinnati.
And I think, and I know this sounds a little bit kind of cliche to an extent, but I think with offense, a lot of it's X's and O's, and with defense, there's a lot of passion involved. And you watch Marcus Freeman on the sidelines at Cincinnati, he was very passionate. He was always chest bumping with his players and stuff like that. I think he wants to do that at Notre Dame as well. While, and I'm not saying Reese isn't like that to an extent, but he, I think just with offense, it's you got to be able to read the field, like you're saying, a little bit more, and X's and O's and stuff like that, I think are a little bit more.
And would you really want to be stuck in a press box with Brent Venables anyway? I mean,
probably not.
I would not.
All right. We got Brian Driscoll on the line from Irish Breakdown, and also Nathan Urbach. And you guys are great to share your time with us. So we want to make sure that everybody can find you. So, Brian, if you can let everyone know where they can find your work.
Best place to find it is irishbreakdown.com. We obviously have a YouTube channel and we have a podcast, but we put all of our stuff on our website anyway. So if you go to irishbreakdown.com, simple, find it. Nathan's done some work for us in the past too, and so we have a great relationship with him. So yeah, irishbreakdown.com is where you can find all of our work. Thanks, Mark.
I'm always grabbing Nathan to come on here and talk Notre Dame football. Nathan, can we find you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I certainly condone going to irishbreakdown.com. You'll probably find some of my work if you dive down deep enough. But
if you're a basketball guy.
Yeah, basketball guy, do a little football recruiting as well. But yeah, no, my Twitter handle is Nathan_Urbach, ERB as in boy, ACH. And then I have sort of a podcast that's been put on hold for a few months here, just with some personal stuff going on. But a Notre Dame podcast to be named later. I do that with Nick Shepkowski on Fighting Irish Wire. And that's another good way to hear my voice or read my work, or not read my work, but get some of the info that we're providing over there.
We have to get to this quarterback situation. Any college football fan is familiar with Jack Cohn. He led a team to a Rose Bowl, and of course, Jonathan Taylor was given most of the credit offensively, and those Wisconsin quarterbacks not given a whole lot of responsibility nor a whole lot of credit. But he did complete 70% of his passes with, I believe, something like an 18-5 touchdown to interception ratio. Brian, what do you expect? Is he going to definitely be the week one starter, or how could this possibly play out?
I'd be surprised if he's not the week one starter. I think that there's probably going to be a battle, but I just don't think the younger quarterbacks are going to be in position to beat out Jack Cohn, because I actually think Jack Cohn's a good football player. And I know that people saw him at Wisconsin, and there's the concerns about, he didn't put up great numbers. Well, mean, other than Russell Wilson, no one's really put up great numbers at Wisconsin. And when you look at his numbers, he was at 69.6% completion percentage. I think you have to go back. Russell Wilson was the last quarterback that was within 5 percentage points of that. So how I like to compare Jack Cohn is you look at what he did, yards per attempt, completion percentage, relative to the other quarterbacks in that offense, and he was far superior. And I would say, I mean, if Quintez Cephas is your dude, he's a good football player, but people complained about Notre Dame not having weapons when they had Cole Kmet and Chase Claypool. When you're putting up production and your best players – Troy Ferguson or Jake Ferguson and Quintez Cephas in the pass game, you're a pretty good quarterback. And, I think he's a gritty quarterback. I think he takes chances. I think I've seen him make some throws where it's like, boy, he threw that ball on time and he read it perfectly and hit the seam and took that chance, put the ball in between two on a corner route and between cover two players. I like what he does. I think he's going to have a lot of talent around him. And I think he's a guy that can execute an RPO offense really well because he's such a quick decision maker. And in the coaching staff's defense, Ian Book was never a guy that was great at processing information quickly. And he could do some of the quick outs and stuff like that with RPOs early in 2018, but there wasn't that next level evolution for him. So maybe that's partly why they didn't feel that could be a big part of what they do, because you have to be diverse with the RPOs. You can't just throw hitches and outs all the time. You got to be able to tack down the field and over the middle and do some different things. So, maybe that's it. But Jack Cohn is a very quick decision maker, very quick processor. He can get to his second read and third read very quickly. By the time he hits his step, in that traditional drop back offense, he's at his third read and he's getting rid of the ball. So I really like him. I think he throws a really good deep ball too. I think the lack of, he went 16 of 32, I think in 2019 throwing the deep ball. They just don't throw it a lot. But when they do throw it, it's like a one-man route, which is obviously going to lower your completion percentage. But I think in the right offense, he could be an effective deep ball thrower, sort of like Mac Jones was for Alabama. I'm not saying he's going to be as good as Mac Jones. I'm just saying you don't have to have Trevor Lawrence's arm to be good throwing the ball downfield. If you can make quick decisions, get the ball out quickly, and be accurate with the football, you can be a good deep ball thrower in college. And I think Jack Cohn can bring some of that to the table. And I think he's going to be a good quarterback. So that's why I think it's going to be harder for those younger guys to beat him out, because he's a really good football player.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's also an underrated athlete. He's definitely not Ian Book or Brandon Wimbush back there or anything like that, but I think he can pick up some yardage with his legs if need be, and he can move around the pocket for sure. And I completely agree on the Wisconsin take. I mean, Wisconsin, much like Notre Dame to an extent, doesn't really have like the updated 2021 offense that a lot of programs have. They also don't get the athletes that Notre Dame does. So while Notre Dame could probably do it, Wisconsin, outside of some of the elite running backs that they've had, like the Jonathan Taylors of the world, they don't have the outside threats at wide receiver or even like the Michael Mayer type at tight end to really push the ball down the field. The other thing I want to mention is, I know obviously me and Brian are both high on Tyler Buckner, but he's a kid that's coming in only really playing one full season of high school football to an extent, or at least at the varsity level.
Nathan, he's played one season of football in the last 3 years.
Exactly.
That's it. I mean, he missed 2018 because of an injury, was brilliant in 2019, and then his 2020 season was ended because of the COVID rules out in California. They didn't have a season. So yes, he's very talented. I gave him a 5-star upside grade. I had him as a 5-star until just the only thing that dropped him out of that 5-star status for me was just the experience part. And that just lowered his grade enough to where he was more of a top 50 guy as opposed to a top 25 guy. But the talent is there, but we need to pump the brakes on expecting him to come in and be brilliant as a freshman. He's going to have a learning curve because he hasn't played football. And I know he's had quarterback coaches and all, but working out at a facility is a whole different deal than playing the game of football on, right, with an line in front of you, with guys running routes, and also with guys trying to hit you. That's the other thing. And so let's just give him some time, and say, well, no, Trevor Lawrence played as a freshman. Well, Trevor Lawrence is a generational player. Like, we got to stop looking at the exception to define the rule. And just because Trevor Lawrence did it, there's a lot. Jameis Winston didn't play as a freshman. He redshirted, so let's just give him some time to develop. And that's why I felt it was smart to go get Jack Cohn. And if Tyler Buckner's as good as everybody thinks and as good as I think, and he's ready to play as a freshman, then play him. But let's not expect him to be ready then. Let's give him some time. find a niche for him, find a role for him, give him some series here and there, let him get his feet wet. But I think it's unfair to him to ask him to be that guy as a true freshman when he's played one season of football in 3 years. I don't think that's really reasonable at this point in time.
Got a question coming in from D-Rock Irish asking about the return game, specifically the punt return, which he calls invisible in recent years. Who do we expect to step up there?
You want to take a shot at that one, Nathan? You know my stance on punt returns.
Yeah, the Kelly way is to go with an experienced walk-on. But sorry, my dog's barking a little bit, so that's why I had my mic on mute for a second. But no, I mean, I think we both love it to be Lorenzo Styles. I mean, I think he'd be terrific at it. But even a guy like Chris Tyree or a Lawrence Keys, if he can get his weight up a little bit. I mean, I think last year they had Salerno back there, and another guy that was reliable and catching the football and stuff like that, whatever. But then they definitely need someone dynamic back there, and I'd love to see someone like a Braden Lenzy or a Lorenzo Styles back there for sure.
For me, I mean, just give me somebody that, number one, can catch the ball. I'm a little bit sort of where Brian Kelly is on this one. I just feel like, when was the last time we saw a punt return break open like a playoff game or a championship game? You just don't see it as much because as teams that punt have changed the way that they punt. So like back in the day, it used to be you had the outside guys, you had your gunners, and you had one personal protector back there because – and so in order to protect the punter, you had to give. I remember my freshman year of college in 1998. I was on the punt cover team, and you have to give your first couple steps to protect. Then you take off, so you're not getting downfield as fast. Well, now because of that sort of that 3-man wall that they have, what they're doing is they're releasing more players downfield, so it's a lot harder to get returns. I would rather Notre Dame spend their time on trying to get better at pressuring the punter and being more effective going after the punter and forcing mistakes that way than to focus too much time on returns. I look, field the punt. Okay. That's the big thing for me. If you have a guy like Devontae Smith was for Alabama, who has a knack for it, then you figure out a way to get that guy the ball and let him do it. So like if Lorenzo Styles comes into your point, Nathan, and he just has a knack for being a big time punt returner, then you say, okay, well, we have a player there. Let's figure it out. But if you don't, I don't think you need to force the issue because last thing I want to do is for a guy to hey, I got to make 2 guys miss as soon as I catch the ball and he fumbles it or he's thinking because it's changed. So I would like to see them heat punters up a little bit more and then force them to make some mistakes, kick a line drive to where then you don't necessarily need a great punter. If he kicks a line drive, you don't need a great punt returner to get 15, 20 yards out of that thing.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I'm at. And until these special teams coaches can figure out ways to be more effective against the way that they're punting now, it's just not something that I'm going to be as concerned with as maybe I would have 10 years ago.
And to your point, I mean, I think Chris Fink was perfectly fine back there. He caught the football for the most part. He occasionally made a decent play and, had a few really close calls for, running one back or something like that. But I think for the most part, Fink was fine. I think with my point is I kind of want to stay away from the Chris Salernos of the world. And that's not a knock on him or anything like that, but put a scholarship guy back there that, like you said, can at least, do something with the ball in his hands. And, and if Lorenzo Styles is that guy, that's great. I worry a little bit about a Braden Lenzy and a Lawrence Keys back there.
Braden Lindsey's not back there for me.
Yeah.
Number one, he doesn't have great natural hands. And number two, he's just, I'm not, that's one thing as injury prone as he has been, that's just not the kind of shot I want to expose him to.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. With all his injuries, it's probably a good idea on that end. But I would say you at least got to put someone back there that at least gives you something.
To me, it'd be Styles and Watts. Those are the 2 guys I'd like to see back there. Xavier Watts is a guy I'd like to see back there doing that too.
Yeah, that's a good call on that one.
We've got Nathan Urbach and Brian Driscoll on the line talking Notre Dame football. You can catch Brian's work at Irish Breakdown on your favorite audio platform or right here on YouTube after you're done watching this. Just put it right there in the search bar, Irish Breakdown. Before I get to Rod's question on the screen regarding conference affiliation, I always love to ask this question just in regards to personnel breakdowns, guys that you would feel can be breakout players this year. And for me, that means a guy that's little used, maybe a special teams player, maybe a guy that sees the field a little bit who can break into the starting lineup, or maybe it's a starting player who can become a nationally known player, an impact player, a really tremendous player. So, Brian, offense and defense, who do you think could break out this year?
Well, offensively, I hope it's one of the two sophomore receivers. I hope it's Jordan Johnson or Xavier Watts, or both of them. I think that Notre Dame's going to need somebody that wasn't a factor last year step up and be a factor. When you lose Javon McKinley and Ben Skoranek, and you didn't really have much production beyond that other than Avery Davis, they need some guys to step up. So hopefully it's one of those two guys. Maybe Kevin Austin's an interesting one because, you'd like to say, well, he's not a breakout because he's been around, but he's got 6 career catches. So, maybe he can be that guy as well. I think we've talked about him so much. It seems like he's played a lot more than he has. They need one of those 3 receivers, in my opinion, to step up. Those 3 guys can be difference makers, change the whole scope of your offense. And if you can get some of those guys to step up and take some of the pressure off Michael Mayer and off Kyron Williams, that's how your offense takes that next step. So hopefully on offense, it's one of those 3 guys this year.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's hard to argue with that. I mean, maybe another guy to throw in there who was used it. I mean, he was probably their second or third running back, and Chris Tyree, you mentioned him a few times, but getting the ball in his hands a lot more often. He's a speed threat anytime, a home run threat every time he touches the football. I think he scored the other touchdown in the Alabama game super late, I believe. And I remember Brian texting me or tweeting something at me right afterwards, and he goes, "Man, if they did that all game, they might have had
it." Was the Clemson game. He comes in his first touch, first touch against Clemson. He goes 21 yards for a touchdown, and I'm like, well, yeah, he couldn't have done that the first 3.5 quarters, right? Apparently Kyron Williams didn't need any breathers in the first 3.5 quarters, which is what Brian Kelly said Chris Tyree's role was last year. So.
Right.
Whatever.
So if it's not, it's got to be one of those receivers, like Brian mentioned. I mean, Kevin Austin would obviously be great. I mean, we've talked a lot about him, but one of the 2 sophomores, or I mean, whoever. I mean, if it's Lorenzo Styles, then that's great too. But he wouldn't really be considered a breakout just because he's a freshman, I suppose. But other than that, I mean, I think Chris Tyree's another option that he needs to touch the football more often this season.
We had a question coming in from the Rod Favre concerning conference affiliation. I've always said that I felt as though, and I'm not taking any other sports into consideration, not taking academics into consideration, that Notre Dame is the fit for the Big Ten. But again, that's just football related. There are other factors involved. Brian, what do you feel about conference affiliation? You guys have to hear this practically every day. Nathan and I have talked about this a number of times. As soon as you say, I cover Notre Dame or I'm a Notre Dame fan, then comes the onslaught of, you guys need to join a conference. You guys dodge people. You've heard it all, of course.
Well, and then, of course, their first year in the conference, they go undefeated in the regular season and play for the conference championship and lose in a rematch to a team they beat earlier. Look, here's my comeback to always that. Hey, Notre Dame was always an independent. They didn't leave. They didn't change. When Notre Dame won a national title in 1988, Florida State was an independent. South Carolina, Penn State, Miami, they were all independents. They chose to join conferences for financial gain. Notre Dame didn't need to do that. So, you can get upset all you want, but, let's not forget when Miami was the U, they weren't in the Big East. They were an independent. And they traveled all over the country to play teams. That's what I loved about Miami back then, is they'd go out and play UCLA. They'd play anybody, any place, any time. And that's what I liked about Bobby Bowden back in the day. Much respected that a lot more than Steve Spurrier, who wouldn't go anywhere. If it was below 60 degrees, he wasn't taking his team there. But, as far as conference play, look, there's advantages to being in a conference, and there's also disadvantages to being in a conference, and the same thing for Notre Dame. I mean, when you're in the Big 12, you get a recruit to play. Most teams play a similar style. You can recruit to play against that. Same thing with the SEC and in the Big 10. Where at Notre Dame, 1 week you're playing Wisconsin, right, and they're ground and pound. And then 2 weeks later, you're playing USC in their air raid with all those athletes. And then a week later, you're playing North Carolina and their air raid, which is more run oriented. It's a completely different situation, and you've got to recruit to be able to beat all those teams. And by the way, if you're good enough to win all those games, you get to the conference, you get to the playoff, and you got to play Alabama or Clemson. So, this notion that Notre Dame has an advantage by not being in a conference, I think is just, 2015, Notre Dame is in Boston 1 week and Palo Alto the next week. Who else does that? Nobody in November. So there are certainly go count the miles Notre Dame travels and compare that to Alabama and talk to me about how it's easier playing in a conference. And that stuff matters. So I don't think Notre Dame needs to be in a conference. And if they were ever going to join a conference, I would like it to be the ACC, because I get where you're coming from, Mark, where the Big Ten is the geographical fit. But to me, I don't think the Big Ten is a fit for Notre Dame from a big picture standpoint, from an institution standpoint, from a, what does the Big Ten really do for Notre Dame? So they get a recruiting foothold in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, where they already have recruiting footholds. Playing in the ACC allows you to play in Georgia, play in Florida, play in Virginia, play in North Carolina. And lo and behold, ever since they started playing in that league back in 2014, all of a sudden you're seeing them get more players from Georgia. They're getting more players from Virginia. They're getting more players from those regions. So to me, it's more beneficial. And I think from an institution, the schools in the ACC are more similar to Notre Dame than the schools in the Big Ten. Not saying that the Big Ten doesn't have good academic schools, but it's 40,000 student academic schools, where Virginia, Duke, those are smaller schools. Those are even the ones that are, Virginia's a public school, but it's more like a private school than it is Virginia Tech or Georgia or Ohio State. So I just think in that regards, the ACC is a much better fit for Notre Dame. And I think the ACC does more for Notre Dame than what the Big Ten would do for Notre Dame. And let's not forget, Notre Dame wanted to be in the Big Ten for years, and the Big Ten said no. So, the Big Ten's the reason Notre Dame isn't in the Big Ten right now. And I'm fine with Notre Dame continuing to say no to the Big Ten for the rest of eternity.
Well, that was a completely selfish statement on my part, just being a college football fan, that geographically Notre Dame's sitting in the middle of Indiana, and they have long-standing rivalries with Michigan, Michigan State, and Purdue, and I would love to see those reinforced, whereas I have no recollection of anything connecting Notre Dame to the
You mean
ACC
you don't remember the game against Sean Moore in Virginia back in '89 in the Meadowlands, Mark?
Actually, I do remember that, but it's a bit obscure, but I do remember that. Yes. So that's my thought about Notre Dame. But I have always defended Notre Dame's scheduling approach, because my goodness, when 2018 hit and they made it through undefeated and reached the playoff, people were saying the schedule was a bit light this year. Well, it had nothing to do with Notre Dame's approach to scheduling, because it's always loaded. It was that Florida State was down, Virginia Tech was down, Stanford was down, USC was down.
Right.
And then I'm looking at this year's schedule. We don't need to defend Notre Dame's schedule. It's one of the top 5 in the nation almost every year. The one thing I'll ask you, Brian, and you, Nathan, as well, is there anything that you don't like about not necessarily this year's particular schedule, but about the approach to scheduling?
I think at times Notre Dame doesn't do its football team any favors by how they'll load up November being on the road the entire time. I think it was 2-3 years ago, they were on the road, I think 4 or 5 of their last 5 or 6 games. And I think those are some of those things that can be challenging. I think it was 2015. They had to play like at Temple, at Boston College, at USC, or at Stanford, like 3 of their last 4 games. And it was a challenge, because that's a lot of travel when you're late in the season and you're already wearing down and you're already more injury prone. So I would like to see them be more balanced there. But that's the challenge, Mark, of trying to fit a 12-game schedule against conference teams that have to work around their conference's schedule. So it's just going to happen that way sometimes. But sometimes you can get a little too home heavy at the beginning, which makes you road heavy at the end, or vice versa. So but I like their new scheduling approach, because they're not just loading up with Septembers. I mean, I felt bad for Bob Davie. He was a bad coach, but there were years where he was playing 4 or 5 top 25 teams before they even got out of September. And now they have those big games early. They had Georgia, last year, for example, in 2019, but they surrounded it with like Louisville and New Mexico and Bowling Green, which takes some of that week after week after week burden that nobody else does, because everybody else has that, that FCS built in. Or Ohio State will play a really play a really good team at the beginning and then play like 3 cream puffs until the Big Ten schedule starts. And then the Big Ten, for some reason, always seems to give them like Rutgers and Illinois at the beginning of the Big Ten schedule, but there's some challenges, but there's also some advantages too. Notre Dame gets a chance to kind of be more loose with their schedule maybe than other teams can. They can truly determine all 12 teams on the schedule. But I like the approach that they've had recently, and I think we're gonna find out that scheduling philosophy in 2022 and 23 when they've got to play Clemson, Ohio State, and USC, all in both of those years. That's gonna be interesting, a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I mean, I echo a lot of what Brian said there. Like I know, they always end in California. That's something that, I mean, they're used to at this point, but at the same time, like, it'd be nice to, I think, what was it, this year was the first time they had their home game, their last home game in November.
I think it was since like 90. The last time was a Hawaii game back when Ron Paulus was, I think, the quarterback, was the last time that they did not end the season at Stanford or California.
And I mean, it's nice from a weather standpoint. I can vouch for that because, and I like it as a fan because living out here in the West Coast, I pretty much go to every Stanford or USC game every year. On the road, I should say. So from that standpoint, I love it. But yeah, no, I mean, I think the one thing I was sort of I grew up in a household that loved the traditional rivals, the Michigan State and Purdue specifically. I was never really huge on the Michigan rival as some Notre Dame fans are. And I think me and Brian have kind of had this discussion in the past.
We agree on it though, by the way. I could care less about the Michigan series.
Exactly. So I
could not care less. Sorry.
I wish they played Purdue and Michigan State maybe a tiny bit more. And I was sad to an extent when that kind of ended, at least the streak ended, I should say. I think they're coming back here on the schedule in the next couple of years, which is nice. But I love the coast to coast outside of the having to travel coast to coast, if that makes any sense. But kind of like what Brian said a little bit earlier with, having the ACC maybe be a better conference for Notre Dame in general. I love, playing Georgia one week and then all of a sudden you're playing, I know Washington State or something like that, whoever it is, it's just a different, it's a different scheduling than anybody else does. And that's what makes Notre Dame unique. And that's not really even from like a bias standpoint. It's just kind of just true and factual. So that part of Notre Dame's schedule, I really enjoy. And so I wouldn't change too much of it, but I think they can maybe do some better things for their athletes specifically if they were able to adjust, maybe going from coast to coast on a weekly basis.
One thing I would like to see change is I wouldn't mind seeing them get rid of Stanford as a yearly opponent. Maybe make Stanford be on there for like a couple home and homes over a decade. And I'd like to see them kind of loosen that up and maybe play more Pac-12 teams, do a home and home at UCLA do a home and home at Oregon, do a home and home in Washington, then bring Stanford back into that rotation a little bit. I don't think Stanford does a whole lot for Notre Dame. It did during a short period of time during the David Shaw era because they were good and it gave Notre Dame a big win. But that's not who Stanford's going to be moving forward. We're already seeing that kind of fall back. They took advantage of the Pac-12 being down, other than Oregon, and did a great job. And I think they did some things that were unique, which made it harder to stop them. But they're fading back, and I just don't know what playing Stanford does for Notre Dame. I'd like to see them mix that up. I'd like to see them, maybe get a little bit more involved in Texas, get TCU on the schedules, something like that. Get a Big 12 opponent a little bit more often than they have. And I would like to see there be a Big 10 home and home every 2 years. I'd like to see them mix up Purdue and Indiana and Michigan State. The Michigan State-Purdue rivalries are one that I especially miss. Because I think to me, for Michigan State, there's also there's a little bit of loyalty there with Michigan State that you kind of have with Navy, because they were the one Big Ten team that kind of had your back when you were trying to get in back in the day. So Michigan State's a team that I wouldn't mind seeing get back on a schedule with a little bit more regularity. USC and Navy are the only opponents I care about having on it every year, but I would like to see the Spartans and the Boilermakers a little bit more than what we plan to see over the next decade.
Our mission is – go ahead, Nathan.
I wouldn't even mind because I know part of the reason they like Stanford is obviously the, kind of them being the other parallel school that is really good academically and also has had some really good, football, has a pretty good history of football and just different things like that, or at least recently, I should say more so for Stanford. I wouldn't mind them kind of interchanging like Northwestern with Stanford every now and then if that's kind of what you want to do, because Northwestern obviously is another program that I wouldn't say necessarily a traditional rival of Notre Dame, but they played them a lot, and I would consider them at least a Midwest rival. And they're obviously very high academic as well, so that wouldn't bother me. Kind of if you want to kind of keep an academic standard to it, switching that off every year or bringing in another program on a yearly basis, playing Vanderbilt more often from an academic standpoint. And a lot of the ACC schools are really good academically, so you kind of get that already. But I kind of like that aspect of it if you're going to take Stanford off the schedule, at least on a yearly basis.
Our mission is best discussion, debate, and analysis of college football, and Notre Dame being one of the pillars of the sport. We have brought in two excellent guys to talk up the Fighting Irish. Brian Driscoll from Irish Breakdown. Again, you can just head right off of this live stream and check out his channel there, Irish Breakdown, either the audio platform of your choice or right here on YouTube. And for whatever portion of the conversation you missed, as most people jumped on late, just wait for the video to post in about 15 minutes and you can catch the analysis at the start of the show as well. Nathan Erbach joins us on a regular basis to break down the Irish. And Brian, you'll be a little bit more on my bandwagon after you hear this declaration. I tell people all the time, especially Florida State fans who don't like to hear this, Notre Dame won the national championship in 1993.
Oh, I hate Boston College so much. It's not even funny.
Two one-loss teams. You played head-to-head. Yeah. I don't see what the issue is.
Well, I mean, if I'm being fair and objective, honestly, I understand why Florida State gets that, because Florida State's loss was on the road to the number 2 team in the country. Notre Dame's loss was at home to a good BC team, but a BC team that finished in the top 15. I mean, that year, Florida State beat a top 10 Florida team. They beat a top 10 Miami team. They beat a ranked Clemson and North Carolina team. They had some good wins that year. Notre Dame also had some really good wins, but at the end of the day, they didn't have as many, to me, top 25 wins as Florida State, and their loss was worse than Florida State. So I understand it. Notre Dame fans are going to be mad at me about that, but look, you just had to beat Boston College and you're playing for a national title, but they didn't handle business. That's why I wish there was a playoff back then, because I would have liked to see that rematch on a neutral field. So, then Florida State fans wouldn't be able to blame it on the grass or whatever other reason that they had for why they lost that game. But I do miss games like that, though. Honestly, I think that's what's one thing that the game doesn't have as much of, is we don't have as many of those. We don't have as many teams in leagues, because now that the leagues are so big and there's so many conference games, you can't schedule 2-3 really tough out of conference games. And if you go back at the 80s and 90s when a lot more teams were independent, and just look at some of the battles we saw from teams across the country. I mean, Notre Dame and Alabama used to have home and homes in the 80s, with each other. And you don't really see that as much anymore. And that's something that I miss as we've gotten into these bigger and bigger conferences. But can I just say one thing?
Absolutely.
There was a response from Rod Farva. He talked about, Michigan having a 25-17 all-time record over Notre Dame. That's exactly why I don't care about the Michigan series, because they were 9-2 against Notre Dame before the end of World War II. You know what I mean? It's like, come on. Like, they taught Notre Dame how to play football. They won the first 8 games of the series. Okay. Like, I do not care about all-time rivals. I don't care about games that happened before my dad was born. I'm sorry. I don't care. It's like Army saying, well, we should dominate Notre Dame back during World War II. Whatever. I don't care. That's why I don't like the Michigan series, because it's just like, it's not even an enjoyable series. Like, I don't enjoy the fan interaction. I don't enjoy going there. There's just not a lot I like about the Michigan series.
I just want to point out that I was 10 months old in '93 when they played Florida State, so I have no comment on that issue.
Yeah, so young bucks, stay out of this. Mark and I are a little older, so we can comment on this one. That was one of the best games that I've ever seen, just because it was just the storylines, the difference in the two programs, the perception and the difference of the two programs. But just, you look back at it now and just think about how many phenomenal all-time great players on that field. You had Derek Brooks, and you had Aaron Taylor, you had Bryant Young. Those are the things I miss. And that's one of the things I love about Notre Dame, covering Notre Dame, is because you have so much history with programs from across the scope of things. It's not just your conference rivals. It's Notre Dame snapping the Oklahoma losing streak, the Notre Dame USC rivalry. Notre Dame and Texas have had some battles in big Cotton Bowls back in the 70s. Notre Dame and Alabama have had some epic battles. And those are the things that I like, that I do miss about the game that's changed. But Notre Dame still has that. Notre Dame gets to go down and play Georgia at Georgia. They get to have Georgia come up, play Notre Dame at Notre Dame for the first time. They get to play Clemson in home and homes. They get to play Ohio State and Texas A&M, and they've even scheduled Alabama in 28 and 29, which is definitely going to be after Nick Saban is retired, which is why I think they scheduled that the way they did. No, Alabama doesn't do home and homes anymore, I don't think, out of conference.
Brian, to your point about non-conference scheduling, somebody was asking me to break down the 78 national championship race and what happened there. I looked at Alabama's schedule. You can't get Alabama out of Tuscaloosa unless they're going to go play in a neutral site NFL stadium. That's the only place they go. That particular year, Alabama, in addition to the SEC schedule, of course, play the first 3 games against Nebraska, Missouri, and USC. And those 3 teams were all ranked in the top 10 in the nation. And that was their non-conference schedule. It's crazy. Well, Notre Dame fans, I tried to give you the 93 national championship, and Brian gave it right back.
I'm sorry. I gotta be honest and objective about it. The overall, because the reason is because it's the argument that I've used to defend Notre Dame in recent seasons. So, Notre Dame shouldn't be in because of this. I'm like, well, look at the overall resume, right? You should be in the playoff based on your overall resume. And that 93 Florida State team, once Notre Dame lost to BC, had an overall better resume. It's one of the things I like about the playoff committee. They don't seem to focus on head-to-head as much as we do in the media and fans and stuff. We obsess over head-to-head. They say, what's your overall resume? And I think that's how a champion should be decided, is an overall resume. I would like to see, if in a perfect world, Nathan, where I'm going with this. I would like to see us incorporate the bowl system, the old school bowl system, with the playoff. It adds one more game for 2 teams. That's it. And that is bring back the old bowl tie-ins. And then after the bowl games are played, then take your time for your Final Four. And then now all of a sudden the Rose Bowl means whoever wins that's got a much better shot. If you're the number 6 team and you're Oregon and you're playing number 2 Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, you got a shot to get back in the top 4. And I think that would eliminate a lot of this discussion we have. Well, how good is the ACC really? How good is the SEC really? They don't play anybody out of conference. Well, go play the bowl games. And then the next 2 weeks, you have the semifinal and the championship game. It adds one more season. And as a former Division III coach, our teams had to play 15, 16 games. Why can't – and we don't get bye weeks at the end of the season. We play 10 games regular season, and then to win the title, you got to play 5 straight games. You'd still get a month off, and so I would love to see that. I think that would make for some great bowl games, and I think that would make for an even more fun playoff in my view.
It would certainly keep kids from declaring or not
more. Yeah, more. Yeah, agree.
Interesting. Well, I'm the guy that's constantly wrestling with the schedule, creating formulas, playoff formulas, but I like that one. I really like that one. Again, Brian Driscoll from Irish Breakdown. Please join him on his platform, whether it be audio or here on YouTube. Irish Breakdown, and Nathan Urbach, who joins us on a regular basis to talk Irish football. Guys, it's been great. It's been a great education. Love hearing the personnel breakdowns. And again, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, anytime. Enjoyed it.
Thanks,
everyone.
Mark.
We'll be back here tomorrow night for a call-in show at 6 p.m. Eastern time. We will see you then.